Hello, all. Thank you for tuning into our channels. We are live on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook today. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, just a brief introduction. My name is Rosanna Rodriguez. I'm a social worker and a mental health professional trained in arts based therapy, queer affirmative counseling practice, and narrative therapy as well. I'm also an associate with Mental Health at Work, which is a vertical of Equilibrio Advisory LLP. And with me today on this live is Smriti, and I'd like to introduce Smriti Makarmida to all of you who may be tuning in for the first time and may be unfamiliar. She is our primary speaker today. She's a psychologist trained in clinical practice and a queer affirmative psychotherapist. There's a lot in her credentials, with expertise in cognitive behavioral therapy and narrative therapy. Smriti, it's always wonderful to be in conversation with you, and I'm really grateful that you've been giving us time to unpack these very deeply nuanced conversations these last couple of weeks. Um, just to set a little bit of context before I get into the questions today, most of you may know we've been spotlighting the theme of anxiety this month in all of the support and resource building work that we've been doing. And we've been keeping with the theme of this year's Mental Health Awareness Week, which has been anxiety this year. Now, last week, when we put a spotlight on anxiety, we really tried to deconstruct it and we tried to understand what it is as an emotion that generally tends to show up when there is a perceived possibility of a future threat that seems a little vague, when there's a lot of unpredictability around the outcome of a situation, and particularly when we have a lot attached to the outcome of that situation, when the outcome is something that we have intrinsic value for. Now, today we are going to go one step deeper and we're going to really contextualize this emotion in the context of work. And that's a little bit of a tricky one because, the workplace is a space where we don't often talk about anxiety and experiences like of emotions like anxiety, which tend to have a lot of meaning attached to it. In fact, I think more and more we are used to hearing about things like stress and burnout, which has anxiety as an underlying emotion at that experience. But we're still not willing to call it anxiety or to label the emotions that may be coming up as anxiety. And there's a lot of anxiety going around, Smriti, and I'm going to invite you in a few seconds to add on to this. But we know that there's a lot shifting in the workspace, in the landscape of things as well. We are hearing about layoffs. We know about increasing work hours that people are putting in. We know that there is still a lot of stigma attached to mental health initiatives and support required. So there is a lot that's really bringing in situations that can make it easier for anxiety to come in. And that's why it's so important, I feel, to talk about it. And Smriti, now I'm going to invite you in to really talk about the relevance of today's topic, also from the perspective of being a leader and somebody who would also be speaking to the leadership teams who may be tuning in today.
And thank you, Rosanna, for setting the context and making me part of today's conversation. And also spotlighting on anxiety and the experience of anxiety at workplaces. So, with more specific focus on leaders and leadership, right? And I feel it's a very important conversation to bring in leaders into the space because leaders do hold a very pivotal position in terms of not only identifying if anxiety as an experience is coming in, but to also formulate policies and create frameworks to extend support to employees who may be experiencing anxiety.
Mhm. That's so true. And I think that's why, we need to have more of these conversations because very often we know that these things may not come up from the bottom. They may not bubble up very organically. And we need to really be able to build those skills to be able to notice what's going on and when we need to intervene. So thank you for setting that in context as well, Smriti. Um, I just want to know, for many of us who may be curious out there, we've talked about anxiety, we talked about what it looks like in general in life, which is something that we're familiar with. But how does it show up at work?
So I think it would show up in very different shapes and forms right now. And I think while we talk about how anxiety really shows up, we need to look at it from two aspects. One is how anxiety would show up, say, in a work from home setup, how anxiety would really show up in physical workspaces as well. Say, for example, anxiety really came in as part of our daily parlance during pandemic, right? Where people started talking about how they're feeling so much anxiety around COVID. And what if I'm feeling anxiety at the fact, what if I am contracted with COVID? What if my family members succumb to COVID as well? And I think that's how the anxiety really came in as well. And when it really spoke of anxiety, like you mentioned, that it is something which is unanticipated. There is we don't really know the outcome of it, but we do see it coming for us, right? And there was a lot of anxiety coming in when there was shift to take place of work from home. And how did it really show up for employees specifically? And let me take a very systemic approach where I would break it down for employees, team members, managers, and leaders of how anxiety really shows up. For employees, we notice in terms of, say, for example, virtual call, the video will go off. You would see people not really responding. And it may even get missed out because it's virtual, you cannot look at other cues. But to really notice those changes in behavior, someone very responsive is now not interacting, not participating in conversation, not voicing their opinion. There is could also be in terms of preoccupation of thoughts being very repetitive in their thought process. Could be not having enough clarity, uh, difficulty making decisions. Sometimes even just saying, what, hey, I don't know. Just willing to just go along, and going with the motions of life as well. Not being very decisive in terms of what they really want. And it's not to reflect that they do not have the competence or the ability to navigate those situations. It's more in terms of the anxiety really playing out. They could also be in terms of using a lot of tentative language. Perhaps I can try. I'm not sure, but maybe. Can I check in later? Can I think about it as well? But and again, it's very important to notice that these are changes in behavior that we're talking about, right? There is also what we've noticed is there could be increase in absenteism, but there could also be increase in presentism. Now, I want to really spotlight on presentism here, which means that people are being present physically, but they're not present mentally and emotionally, which means that which cost businesses a lot more than absenteeism as well, because you have a resource which is not really turning in the work that is expected of them. Now, this also has an impact for the team members when this happens. Say, for example, now someone who is there is absenteeism or presentism, they're not pulling their weight. That work, those demands, the work would fall back on the team members, leaving them also feeling frustrated, stretched, stressed, burnout taking place, right? And then there could also the change in team dynamics that could take place where there's a lot of conflict happening. People are feeling disengaged, feeling stretched, demotivated. The morals have gone down. And again, I think it's really important as leaders then to really look at these signs in terms of how anxiety could show up. So there is an individual experience, which we did spotlight in the last conversation. There is also in terms of how it could reflect only pertaining to work, and then in terms of how anxiety could show up within teams and team dynamics.
Absolutely. And Smriti, I think we are taking the conversation much further than what we stepped into last time. Because what I'm also hearing, last time we talked about how impact is located within the self, and we really talked about how anxiety causes impact to an individual. But when you were sharing, I'm also hearing how anxiety causes impact to the people around. Like my anxiety and my response to that anxiety may cause an impact to my team, which may influence their levels of anxiety, which could also then cause impact to a larger organization or an organism like an organization as well, right? In terms of business goals, just the morale within the organization and team, right? And how that really tends to change and shift as well. So thank you for really spotlighting the layers that really exist within this issue that seems so isolated and seems so, just about one person and one individual, and really showing us how the connections really tend to actually lay themselves down, right? And how just a drop here could have ripple effects that are far reaching and that we want to avoid as leaders and as part of the leadership team. I'm also really excited about some of the spotlights that you put on the overt sort of signs that we could notice that could point to potentially a person being experiencing anxiety within our team. And that's such an important thing for all of us to be able to build that skill to notice that something's wrong or something may require support. I won't say something's wrong, but someone may require support, and to really be able to look at it with that empathy and reach out to be able to provide support or even have a conversation about what support could really look like. I just want to circle back to a few of the things that you said that really, really stayed with me. Particularly that you said that this is not just about something that we can see, but it could even be happening when employees are working remotely. Just basis any changes in their behavior that we may notice, or uh, you know, uh, them dropping off calls, not agreeing to put on their videos, certain things like that you spotlighted. Changes in language from being perhaps assertive to being more tentative, the use of perhaps, maybe, I'll see, a preoccupation, lack of clarity, the inability or the difficulty to make decisions without checking in with others. I think these are really, really powerful tools that we're spotlighting. And again, not in isolation, but because of a sudden or gradual change that we may notice in our employees or in our colleagues as well. So thank you for putting that out there. I think this is a very interesting point in our conversation to really check in with you and say that, we know what anxiety is, we know what impact it could cause, but when does it usually come up in the context of work? What are those situations that make us more vulnerable to experience anxiety, or that just bring in a sense of anxiety just because of the nature of the situation itself? So, if you could just tell us a little about that.
Sure. Uh, and I think I'm going to again break down the response into two parts. When anxiety comes up, where it is, I think, more or less expected. When there's any significant event, say for example, at workplace you're having an appraisal, or there are conversations around new opportunities. You have to go on site, a different new project, right? Where they know that the stakes are very high, and the outcomes are also going to really influence the career trajectory the person is likely to have. The other set of significant events that could bring in anxiety would be also the changes people may be going through in their personal life, which could mean getting married, having a child, and the parents moving in, parents moving out. So changes in the family structures, sudden demise in the family, loss of relationships, even loss of a partner, or an intimate relationship as well, that could also bring in a lot of anxiety. To the extent, even say relocation of changing houses has brought in a lot of anxiety. I'm recalling one of my clients talking about this, the fact that they have changed houses, where now earlier the travel time used to be about 10 minutes to work, and now it's become 45 minutes to work. And to just cope with that change of the increase in travel time brought in a lot of anxiety, because that meant getting up 45 minutes earlier, or maybe even an hour earlier, because the traffic would increase, something they were not really used to. The systems had changed because of change of a house. That means the support systems change in terms of domestic help, about groceries, to finding those systems into place as well. Earlier, taking a maybe their own car to work, now having to take local trains in Bombay to work. And all that brought in a lot of anxiety, which meant that when they enter the workplaces usually already exhausted,
Mm.
and then to really cope with the demands of the workplace. And then, because of the change that happened, it also means the person is also undergoing a change in their career. They are at a higher position. That means more demands. And entering that workplace with exhaustion was also bringing anxiety of how people may be perceiving that exhausted state, right? The third group, which I want to really spotlight, that often gets unnoticed, is the smaller things that brings in anxiety, where people don't expect you to be anxious, to be feeling that anxiety, but it still lingers on, and it's like a friend that walks in with you in workspaces unknowingly and not wanting. There have been cases, some of the clients have told me about how they have experienced a sense of dread by just getting a call from someone, an experience of heightened anxiety when a meeting invite pops up from a senior, and the first thought is, am I going to be fired? Or when there's anxiety
Mm.
coming in terms of just being triggered or being in a workplace which is very toxic, where are remarks being made on one's gender, if people are from vulnerable groups as well, and there are certain acts of exclusion that are being experienced by people as well. And the subtle forms of discrimination, of not feeling that they don't belong here. As soon as they enter in the cafeteria, everyone goes quiet. When
Mm.
people are making a plan of going out for drinks in the evening, no one checking in with them, and not really knowing, should I ask, should I not ask? Will I be intruding into this space or not intruding into this space? And those subtle, covert forms of discrimination, experience, exclusion, not knowing if they belong there, the toxicity in the environment, and that bring in a lot of anxiety as well in those spaces. There are also spaces, where people may experience anxiety owing to the position that they hold in the organization, and I think I would like to even spotlight that maybe at some point in time of how leaders experience a lot of anxiety, and that's often goes unnoticed and not spoken of.
Absolutely. And Smriti, thank you for very neatly really categorizing this, right? We're looking at change essentially and a person coping with or getting used to navigating that change that could bring in a sense of anxiety, whether it's change in their personal life, their surroundings, but how that never really stays in our personal life, right? Those feelings and that emotion and those thoughts tend to walk in with us into the workplace. Thank you for also showcasing how these are not two separate lives that we lead. It is the same life and there are repercussions either way. I'm sure for a lot of us we also take home what happens at the workplace and the emotions that we feel there, and it's quite cyclical that way. Thank you also for pointing out how identity and culture really intersect uh, to create situations of anxiety that may not seem anxiety inducing to a third person who may not have the same identity. For me, if somebody doesn't invite me for something, it may not shake me or rattle me or create that anxiety about acceptance because perhaps I don't have a marginalized identity. But for a person who is experiencing that vulnerability already and is experiencing acts of exclusion all the time, that could really bring in, a lot of emotions, anxiety being predominant as well. A question that I have specifically for you as a follow up to this is, you talked about culture, but I want to also talk about the role of policy in reducing anxiety or reducing the intensity of anxiety. And I'm hoping that you'll also maybe talk a little bit about your experience being a Posh consultant and expert and co-founder of Posh at Work as well, and how in those specific situations the lack of implementation or the lack of having a policy at all also leads to anxiety. And if you can talk a little bit about specific incidents, but also how other policies may contribute to a person's experience of anxiety at work.
Yeah, and I think it starts from there, right? From the policy, because when you talk about organizations' policy, they are a reflection of the intentions of the leadership in terms of what are they really hoping to create as a culture in the organization, and the kind of redressal mechanisms or that are available for people to really reach out to in case there is a grievance or in case there is a difficulty or they're struggling with something as well, right? And when we talk about these policies, in my experience of working with organizations across industries and leadership as well, seldom I've noticed a policy on well-being. They may have a policy for EAP, where you may have the organization may have recruited employee assistance program providers, wherein the employees of those organizations can avail therapy services free of cost, and they may have a document talking about availing EAP services. But what does well-being really mean does not really stand out in most of the organizations. It may get reflected through other policies and intentions and town halls and conversation, but it may not be documented there, right? Uh, But some
Hmm.
policies may cover that. For example, the code of conduct policy or misconduct policy or anti-discrimination, anti-harassment policy, prevention of sexual harassment policy. These policies may cover in case there's any kind of impact, mental trauma that the person is going through, they have those forums and redressal mechanisms available to them, right? But I think it's very important to again deconstruct this a little bit more right now. When you talk about the experience of anxiety, how will it really show up? Say, for example, right now I have come back from my maternity leave. I don't know if I'll be given the same position, similar clients, similar team or not. And even if I do, I don't know or I'm not very sure whether I will get the same respect I had earlier because I was on a break. And that brings a lot of anxiety. Also, things are evolving rather rapidly recently with the whole advent of AI, the kind of platforms that have been are evolving right now. Even 6 month, 8 month, or year-long break as well seems like a long gap. And to you always feel you're playing catch up, and I'm not there yet right now. And anxiety really shows up in those spaces. There could be anxiety coming, like you spoke about, marginalized identities. Now, if today I am a person who is from the queer and the trans community right now, if I'm not, have not come out, I'm not living authentic lifestyle right now, that brings anxiety every single day. If I have come out and I've been misgendered or there's been dead naming that has happened as well, that brings an anxiety, right? If people are going through affirmation procedures and th- that space is not being given. Say, for example, the leave policy does not take into account the leave I may need when I am going through a gender reaffirming procedure right now. That brings a lot of anxiety because I need financial. There'll be financial constraints. I'm going to lose my job because I've taken leave more than what I'm entitled for as well. So those kind of policies further marginalizes queer and trans folks as well in these spaces, right? Say, for example, if you have insurance and partner benefits. Now, today, if I'm a gay person, lesbian person, and I have a partner, but my policies do not cover those insurance benefits, it's not extended to my partner, I feel excluded from this culture because those benefits are being given to partners in heterosexual relationships, right? So those policies also we talk about those. If you talk about, say, posh policies, spoke specifically about posh as well. And in my experience of working with people, they said that it's been very anxiety inducing, not only the experience of harassment, but also the type of harassment we've experienced. It almost seems that I'm justified to raise a complaint if I have experienced a physical form of sexual harassment, if there has been physical assault, as opposed to if I have been experiencing verbal form of sexual harassment. Someone calling me sexy is not as severe for me to file a complaint as opposed to someone coming and groping me. Not realizing that those remarks are also very objectifying, dehumanizing as well, or the fact someone just staring at me and making remarks that, oh, you got here because of how you look and how you know how to charm people, also trivializes the competence and the value that I bring to the team as a professional. And those have brought in a lot of anxiety because of the constant dilemma that people grapple with. Can I even file a complaint or not? And if I do, would I be judged for being too uptight and not being a sport and blowing things out of proportion? And then to create these sensitization programs and creating awareness among different stakeholders becomes fairly important as well. And to hold on to this empathy that each of these situations are going to bring in anxiety among the other gamut of emotions in these situations. So, as leadership, when you are, and one is formulating policies to really look at the experience in a very nuanced manner and being very perceptive to what the experience could be becomes very important, and weave that into the policy frameworks.
Follow-up question, Smriti. I mean, you've made such pertinent points. I think really capturing how various groups would experience anxiety vis-a-vis the policies that we have when the policies do not see the lived realities or unique life stresses or make provisions to be able to support beyond, the charmed heteronormative that we are so used to seeing and believing. But I want to ask you, because this is something that you started this segment off with. You started by saying that there are not a lot of spaces that have standalone well-being policies, while there may be all of these policies that feed in. Just want to ask you, do you see the merit in having a well-being policy when there may not be a law? Like, I mean, when we do talk about posh policies and posh act, there is the posh act that sort of enforces this. But in the absence of something similar for a mental health or a well-being policy, do you think leadership needs to start thinking about having these policies nonetheless?
Absolutely. Uh, because in my experience now, all employees, not all, but no, most of them, people are looking at being seen, being heard at workplaces, and be respected for who they are. People are gone to the extent of turning down high-paying jobs if they feel that it's going to cause them mental health is going to jeopardize the mental health at this point in time
Mm.
right now, because people are exhausted. They are looking for that break as well. And if employers and organizations do not wake up to this, people are going to be losing talent. In my experience of working with clients, people have quit from their jobs because the culture was very toxic, or the fact that when they needed a break, they were pushed and pushed and pushed, right? To the extent that they came to a breaking point. To the extent of people, I could see people that, they're holding, they couldn't, they'll have tremors, the hands will start moving like this, to not be able to face people, even people with 20 years of experience as well. Coming to a point, this one client of mine spoke of the experience anxiety was so heightened that just to make a simple decision of how to schedule a meeting, who to schedule the meeting with, and how do I open a meeting was becoming a struggle. And this is a person who was part of a senior leadership with 20 years of experience that we're talking about. There was another person who spoke of in terms of how just getting restful sleep had become such a challenge for the last 3 to 4 years, till the point they put in their papers, moved away from the urban city, and started doing took up a job that was paying them 80% lesser than what they were earning earlier. So employees are looking to be taken care of, that it needs to move away from just business demands and business requirements, but to also incorporate mental well-being into the policy frameworks to ensure that we are retaining talent. And like I also mentioned, even if there is presentism happening, that you have employees in the organization and they're not working, it's a business loss. To the extent of, I think the business loss could be even 2.3 times more than by just having these employee benefits for the entire workforce, right? So it's important that we do have these policies, and there is a shift that is happening. Like for one of the organizations, we did make a caregiving policy for them, wherein they had really looked into the different demands of different caregivers, not only from the parental lens, but also one being a caregiver to ailing parents, to having a relative who could be terminally ill, and to really look at the demands that could be placed on them, and how can organizations create frameworks and support structures to help them navigate through these changes and demands that are happening in their personal life. So organizations are clearly waking up to this. They're making the shift. At this point in time, the number is fairly minuscule who has taken up this initiative, but there is value in it, and the research also supports this. Also, if you see globally as well, if you look at a lot of these Scandinavian countries, Poland, they do offer these leave policies, support building support structures to ensure that employees are feeling taken care of, because now an employee is no longer an employee. They are being viewed as humans with different responsibilities, different demands that goes beyond the workplace, and there is merit in it.
Thank you so much for putting that. I think there's nothing I need to summarize. That was very, very impactful and very, very crisp and clear. I mean, everything you say is, but this really is resonating with me on various levels, and it's heartening to know that there is a shift, even if there is a small shift, but that organizations are, as you put it, waking up to start incorporating more, start looking at their policies, start making those radical shifts, even in the absence of a statutory requirement to do so. Another thing that I just wanted to highlight that you spoke of, and we will talk about it a little later, but you also talked about how anxiety is something that is experienced even by people who are considered to be seasoned veterans, people with 20 years under their belt and even more. Right? So we're not really looking at anxiety only as a sort of experience that comes out of not having as much experience, so to speak, or immaturity, or just starting out. But an emotion that keeps coming up in various shapes as a response to the situation around us. Um, you did talk about this, Smriti, and you've covered. I think I'm going to ask you about the vulnerable groups who is at higher risk to experience anxiety. But I think you have spoken, on queer and trans folks and the sort of the heightened vulnerability towards experiencing these kind of situations. You also spotlighted mothers and caregivers, people who are managing and juggling these multiple roles. who may also be at a heightened risk to experience anxiety. But are there any other groups of people that could potentially, be groups that the management or leadership teams need to keep in mind while drafting policy?
So it's very important to also look at people with disabilities, neurodiverse folks. We did talk about it in our last session as well, right? And though we are not seeing many, a good representation from these communities and groups of people as well. But while we are drafting policies, like I said earlier as well, that the policies need to reflect the intention of the organization. So if the organizations are truly looking at building inclusive workspaces, the policies will be the first step towards it. And it's important that we do start thinking about diverse groups and taking into their unique life stresses as well, and what support structures could look like. Say, for example, and say people with disability. So I know this one organization was consulting, and they had a mandate that all meetings will happen on the ground floor.
Okay.
Right? This was a standard mandate, right? So the idea is that it needs to be comfortable for any person, whether it's a person who is expecting, someone may who have just fractured their leg, a person with a disability. So it becomes even very comfortable for external stakeholders as well who are coming for meetings, because they don't have to go around look where the meeting is going to take place. The security becomes easier if people are running late for different reasons. Again, it becomes faster for them to get to the meeting. So there was a lot of intention that is put into having this kind of a mandate. And like I had mentioned in my last conversation, that any kind of policy which is inclusive does not only help marginalized folks, it helps everyone. It's about how are we making our workspaces convenient, comfortable, and inclusive for every person, right? So if you're looking, say, for example, like people who are neurodiverse as well, what are the kind of policies in terms that could be simple to understand? Say, for example, instructions.
Hmm.
When you're talking about, say, someone on the autism spectrum, for example, giving them, they only understand that, direct messaging. If there is any ambiguity, that's going to increase the experience of anxiety for them. So now, if we talk about clear, direct messaging in short sentences, it's going to be helpful for everyone again, right? Rather than, I expect something more from you. What is more? This year in appraisal meeting, having this conversation, this year was good, but no, but I think you can do better. What is better?
Hmm.
I would like you to maybe do, say, about 10 meetings a week. I would like your business targets to go 2x. Being very, very clear and direct in messaging is going to be helpful for everyone. And that is why when you're looking at these policies, it needs to take into consideration what brings in anxiety. And here the skills of leaders would really come in, to be able to be very preemptive in their approach and intuitive, to anticipate that if this is going to be the communication, how is it going to really and land on the person, and playing out this entire scenario. And if we do this and looking at representation from different groups, how is it going to influence and impact different groups of people as well? Like the example I spoke about, having meetings on the ground floor. The leadership here really invested time to play out the scenario for each and every individual. And they
Hmm.
felt there is merit in having this kind of a mandate. So to really spend time to look at just not from the normative stance of the people, but also looking at people on the fringes, and how do we make policies that can manage their anxiety or the experience of anxiety adequately, obviously keeping into consideration what falls under the employer's realm.
Absolutely. Thank you for really putting that together concisely, Smriti. And I think what's really coming through, I think also perhaps not just from your experience of being a part of so many organizations as an expert, really bringing in the mental health and other perspectives. But I think what's also standing out is your own leadership skills and expertise, being a leader yourself at Equilibrium Advisory. And I'm noticing that what's coming through is that there needs to be a very clear intention and vision for what we want to create, and what that inclusive space could really look like. Take into account the marginalized identities we may come in contact with, not just as employees but also people who may be visiting, and that really did stand out to me in the example you took. And also then look at the situations within the workplace context that could possibly bring in the sense of anxiety, like changing roles, interns coming in, new recruits coming in, sabbaticals, long leave, coming back after that. Really, really then identify the possible gaps and plug them in through policy. So thank you so much for saying that. uh, I'm going to go deeper into this conversation on vulnerability and vulnerable groups. Do you think leadership and leaders experience anxiety? Because we've talked about virtually everyone else, and you did touch on this earlier. We did talk about seniority, but specifically, do leaders experience anxiety and how?
They do, uh, and uh, and I think the experience of anxiety is fairly heightened, but they, because of the skills that they have and the experience they have, they do power through. But when you talk about anxiety that the leaders experience, it's also different in nature as opposed to employees or facing anxiety at the entry level or middle management level. Because what happens at the leaders, at the leadership level, is very lonely at the top. So to be able to talk about your anxiety becomes very, very difficult because there are not many peers. It's a pyramid structure, right? So they at least, and I'm talking about top leadership right now. I'm not talking middle management, that they also come in the category of leaders, but I'm specifically talking about people at the top, right? As part of the board, senior leadership, CXOs is what I'm really targeting out here. And often my experience of working with CXOs, they've spoken in terms of that, I'm experiencing all this, but I can't share this with anyone. One is that I cannot afford to come across as vulnerable and weak, or the fact that I don't have a grip over the situation. And these statements really talk about how isolating and alienating the experience is for leaders there. Also, the unique life stressor for leaders that come is the fact that they are first ones to get the news of the change that's likely to happen in the organization. For example, a merger is likely to take place. The company is going to likely to get acquired. Or the fact the business is not doing too well, we have to lay off X number of people. They're usually the first receiver of the news, positive or negative, right? And to not be able to really have that communication trickle down till there is no clarity of a plan. So while they are already juggling and struggling with their own anxiety, through all of that, they need to also have a plan of how the change would really take place. For example, today, if the mandate is I have to lay off 1,000 people in the organization, this is what I need to understand from, and globally I have got this information that the business is not doing well in India. You need to lay off X number of people. I need to figure out now who these 1,000 people have to be, from which departments, at what level. Do I look at experience? Do I look at the cost to company? Yeah, do I need to lay off senior people, or maybe, or do I lay off that one senior person and save 10 people's job at the entry level because I have to manage my resources right now? Who is going to do the communication? What will the communication really look like? Because they are also aware of the fact that laying off means there is going to be an impact to the family. People have EMIs going out. People have responsibilities, have dependents. There could be school fees or parents being dependent on someone as well. It could also be a sense of inadequacy that comes in, loss of self worth. Even there's nothing about the individual, but the communication is taken very personally. Not being very sure if they will get another job or not. How will that gap really reflect in the CV? And all of these thoughts run into leaders' minds, yet they're not able to speak about it, and often again seen as someone who has not taken care of the team. When they are also experiencing a sense of helplessness because they have to do what is needed to be done at a business, for the business. This is one level of anxiety that leaders experience. Second could be also their own personal struggles. I have worked with leaders, who have had personal losses, demise in the family, but had to show up to work every single day with a strong face and to showcase that, I have the strength to get through this, when all they want to do is just break down and cry and not look at work, but to be able to show up every single day because they are accountable for this entire firm or the organization that they're running. Thirdly, there could also be the fact that they are experiencing anxiety. There have been clients who have spoken about they've been diagnosed with anxiety disorders, feeling, just when they are about to enter into a meeting, feel that their hands start sweating, they can't think through, they are choking, and the constant self talk is, "Oh, you're going to embarrass yourself. You're going to showcase the fact that you don't have it in you to be a leader as well." And that negative self talk further increasing anxiety, sometimes even paralyzing people in those situations as well. And and that experience stays. Every time they have to go for the following meeting, they're tongue tied, not able to speak up, start choking, and then wanting to just avoid the situations. And then that becomes like a vicious cycle, because once you start avoiding the anxiety, every time you're faced with a situation, the anxiety is going to increase right now. And they start taking a step back gradually, unless really managed with therapy and coaching, which there are alternatives to that as well. And that's how I have worked with leaders through those spaces and conversations. But but it is a lonely experience at the top. So just to summarize, leaders do experience anxiety. The nature is very different, and it's a very lonely experience.
Yeah. Srithi, thank you for. I appreciate that you have really humanized certain decisions and certain situations in the that fall to leadership that we tend to view very differently very often. I mean, even as you were speaking, I was thinking about all the headlines that say, layoff, so many people laid off here and laid off, in this organization, in XYZ organization. And very often we feel a lot of empathy for the people who've been laid off. But what you've also just showcased is that there is a lot of dilemma. There is a lot of ethical dilemma. Quite often, there is a lot of juggling that needs to happen with one's own emotions to be able to make these decisions that are business decisions that fall to leadership as part of their role. Um, and I think you brought in a level that maybe a lot of us hadn't really considered before when thinking about that position. I have a follow up question for you, actually, Smriti. You mentioned that leaders, when you started this segment, you said, leaders, people in the leadership experience anxiety and they power through. What is powering through? What impact does it have? And what is an alternative to powering through for leadership?
So I think for leaders, I mean, to also recognize that leaders have reached this position after going through this entire journey of being at the entry level, middle management, and then becoming a senior, right? They have identified themselves in terms of what their strengths are, what their areas are where they really need support as well, and they may have t- taken that journey either alone or with someone through this experience. So when you talk about powering through, is the fact that if there is adequate self-awareness, they would know in terms of, okay, this is an anticipated event where I am likely to experience a lot of anxiety. How do I prepare myself for this very actively and still show up the next day while I'm experiencing anxiety? Right? So I think there is a lot of self-awareness and self-work that has gone into powering through, wherein the anxiety is not going to be crippling and paralyzing, but also to be able to embrace that emotion, to know that this emotion has come in because I am perceiving threat, I'm perceiving some kind of harm, but I know this anxiety also serves a positive purpose for me. This anxiety makes me sit down with a pen and paper and say, okay, you know, I need to look at the pros and cons and do the cost benefit analysis right now in terms of, and how do I mitigate this situation. So it puts me in an action oriented phase right now. So that's the second part of powering through. So once the self work, self awareness happen, I look at what is this function and purpose this anxiety is serving me at this point in time. How do I be selective of that process and take what anxiety has come in for, which is I need to sit down and weigh the situation, analyze the situation as well. And thirdly, how do I embrace my anxiety? So, what are the things that I need to do so that I can sit with my anxiety and still be fully functioning and be productive and work at an optimal level? Which means, like, for example, some of my clients, we have done work like, if there's a meeting that does bring in a lot of anxiety, or there's certain stakeholders who tend to be very difficult, and that brings in anxiety because they're asking those questions, which may also may not be reasonable, but the demands are yet being made as well. How do we prepare ourselves for it? So, is there a kind of a note that you can send prior to the meeting to those stakeholders? put down the clear agenda, what we'll be focusing on as well, to really keep the session discussion focused, because unreasonable demands can be made. Reaching half an hour before the meeting. Is it possible to set up some one-on-one meetings with all the stakeholders before you get them in a room together, right? And there are a lot of these steps that would go in with leaders to be able to then navigate that situation as well. And lastly, very importantly, that inviting compassion for themselves, that anxiety does not define them. Anxiety is just, it's very important. Often, in our therapy, and you will resonate with this, that the problem is the problem, person is not the problem, right? So how do you also separate yourself from this experience of anxiety, where this anxiety is not telling you about your competence and whether what you can deliver or not deliver. Anxiety is an experience that you're experiencing in that moment, and you will be able to get past it once anxiety is over, once a situation is over, provided someone has not diagnosed with anxiety disorder, because then this entire approach will look very, very different. So what I've really laid out for you right now is someone who's experiencing anxiety but not been diagnosed with anxiety disorder. Hope that
Thank you for
helps.
clarifying that. It was very helpful. Because I'm glad you actually went into this and I asked you the question also, because I was thinking that powering through meant that you just push through, ignore all the emotions and do what you need to do, which is an approach that I know a lot of people take, but it may not be healthy in the long run. And I think what you've really laid out is very beautifully what powering through could be. The alternative of powering through, really being empowered and powering through, could look like with insight, awareness, self-work, and then taking measured responses, channeling the energy of the anxiety towards fulfilling goals. When we spoke about leadership, we've spoken about leadership, as receiving from the higher ups or from the other, the global teams, and they get this information that they need to pass on. We've talked about leaders, vis-a-vis themselves in their leadership role. My last question on leaders and anxiety is, there are times that there is not pleasant information that has to be passed on, or not pleasant situations, challenging situations within the workplace that need to be navigated. Perhaps there is, number of people have left recently, and there is a lot of work to be managed with a small team. Perhaps there is a lot of unrest. Perhaps there is a lot of anxiety that they are able to sense amongst their employees. Now, when it comes to the relationship with the leader and the employee, and there is anxiety already there, the leader is able to sense anxiety within themselves as well as amongst their team. Can leaders be vulnerable?
Um,
I know that's a
I'm
complex
finding,
question.
yes. In ideal scenario, in a utopian world, yes. I think it'll be great. I think if leaders could be vulnerable. Unfortunately, I don't think leaders feel that confident to really be that vulnerable with employees at large, because of not really knowing of how people will perceive that vulnerability as well, right? And before I even talk about leaders being vulnerable, I think it's also important to understand whether employees are able to be vulnerable itself, because there is a
Mm,
struggle there itself, right? So if someone is struggling in being vulnerable at an entry level, it becomes a lot more harder for the leader to be vulnerable. However, if the leader has created an environment and space where employees can be vulnerable, it can act as a catalyst and support leaders to be vulnerable as well. So
mm,
the vulnerability is going to be a function of the culture that has been created in the organization itself. So I would like to go start off with the employees' vulnerability and how that could really look like, and then move to leaders' vulnerability, if that's okay.
sure, sure.
Right. So this is something I think we had discussed the last conversation as well, in terms of employees just being vulnerable enough to come up and say, you know what, hey, I'm experiencing anxiety, has been a struggle for a lot of people, because they may perceive this information as being incompetent or not fit into doing their tasks or taking on newer opportunities or leadership opportunities, also even from entry to middle management level, right? If the leaders have been able to create a space where they say that it's okay for people to experience different emotions because it's part of the human experience, and for people to come up and talk about their own struggles with their mental health or the anxiety they're experiencing, there will be space to have these conversations, which could be compartmentalized and not made internalized with the person. that really opens up space for people to start talking about it as well, right? Generally saying the fact that, you know what, hey, today I'm languishing, I'm feeling very blah, or just sending a message to the manager saying, what, hey, you know, I don't think I can focus today. I'm finding myself very distracted. It's difficult for me to focus right now. Is it okay for me to take the day off? Or the fact that right now I don't think my head is in the right space. I just, and I'm going through a breakup right now. I'm going through some massive changes in my personal life. It would be okay for me to take a couple of days off. And if that space has been created, it's okay for then the managers to come back and say, you know what, you know, hey, today, you know, I know I had scheduled this meeting today, but I don't think I'm in the right mind space to have this conversation. Will be okay for us to reschedule this. It works both ways, right? And the team will understand and give that space to the person if they want to just take some time off and reschedule the meeting, right? What's happening on the other hand right now? Today I'm languishing. I don't feel I have it in me to just focus on work and be completely present. Either there's going to be presentism, or I'm going to say, what, you know, I'm down with fever. I can't come into work right now. What is the message that's going out with this? The fact that if someone is physically unwell, it's okay to take time off. But if someone's mentally not feeling okay, it's not okay to take time off. So we need to start normalizing those conversations. If it starts off from the employees, there's also managers then, you know, who are saying, you know what, here, I can't be present here. And if this is the culture that we've created in the organization, and then the leader says, you know what, hey, today, you know what, I'm not in the right mind space. I had a very critical meeting with my global leadership right now. There's a lot to process. Would be okay if I just take time off and I reschedule this meeting, and telling them one down this. People will understand. So when we talk about the vulnerability that's coming in, it's also in terms of the intention that the leader had, how that has really trickled down into the entire system, implemented at a practical level, and then that would feed into this entire system of creating that vulnerability, which is not being stigmatized and tabooed, but to really looking at each individual as a human who goes through these ups and downs and these mood changes as well. So I know it's a long answer to your question, but I guess it's more into the systems that we are creating and supporting through this to allow for vulnerability to take in, which is not seen as something, it is not looked down upon, but just seen as a human experience.
Yeah. And I think what you're talking about, culture building, is something that's so new societally as well. And organizations are often a reflection of society, and not a lot of places create space for people to be vulnerable and talk about their anxiety. And I can just imagine, as you were giving the examples of, hey, there was a meeting with the global team, it was a bit overwhelming and I need time to process. If I put myself in that place, and if I were in that space of leadership, I was just imagining the level of anxiety that I would be feeling to even be able to say those words out loud, because of the pressure to always be perfect. I feel that also sort of creeps into these leadership roles, making it more difficult. Sometimes I think it is easier for others to be vulnerable and talk about their vulnerability, whereas when you look to the leader to be the one leading, you're also, it's a bias which is unfair because leaders are human, but we do also look at perfection, and people look at themselves as needing to be perfect all the time. So thank you today for breaking that down and talking about just how many levels of anxiety exist, and also showing that leadership could be also a group that we need to look at when we're drafting policies, as a group that can experience anxiety, and as a group that needs certain perhaps training, perhaps talking spaces, mentorship spaces in place, to be able to scaffold them with their journeys. So thank you for that. We are 6 minutes left. I know we've talked a lot. Um, we also have questions coming in. Uh, should should There's one question more that I have. Would you like to take Praful's question before we close our conversation? Uh,
I'll leave that to you. I haven't seen
okay.
the question as yet.
The it, it was, new joiners are anxious about their new job and work. I would like to know how one can deal with the new job anxiety. Any suggestion or practices to lower down the anxiety level? And how do you embrace and accept the fact that one is facing anxiety when we are afraid to do so and face the reality? So it's a two-part question.
All right. I think it's a very relevant question as well. So maybe we can take that if that's okay.
Yes, yes,
Uh,
I think so.
Right. So I think thank you, Praful, for staying with us for this entire session and asking this question as well. So you talk about new joiners with anxiety. I think it's very real, right? And to also recognize now here again, I'm going to break this down into two parts. One is say if there is one person who has joined the organization, or it's a group of people who have joined the organization. So the intervention may look similar but slightly different as well, right? So let's start off. There's a cohort of people who have joined in the organization, and a lot of people experiencing anxiety. As part of a process, a lot of organizations have an induction program. I think if we before we start off with the induction program itself, which is can be very overwhelming because it's very heavy on information, different policies, systems, structures, expectations. If we can just take a pause and to really focus on that anxiety as well, perhaps even doing an exercise of where they're at. Sometimes what we do as one of the exercise is that you have like a thermometer and say, okay, where would you place your anxiety at, right? And just checking in of where people are at right now. Or even if you have like a thermometer, what is that you're most excited about? What is it that you're experiencing anxiety about as well? What are some of the questions you may have? And really to have an open-ended conversation could be very, very helpful there. And this also brings in a sense of solidarity because most of the people, like you recognize, is also experiencing anxiety. In fact, the person who will be conducting the session will also be experiencing anxiety because they have been shown this as a phase of the organization and they need to do a very implicit pressure is to do a good job of it for the new cohort to feel welcome, right, and come across as approachable, as knowing having answers to all the questions. So they are also experiencing anxiety, and I want to also bring that onto the table here. So starting off with in terms of doing a check-in, where people are at right now, how are they feeling, what are they excited about, what are they anxious. If people are not answering open-ended questions, doing a close-ended question like a thermometer, asking them to rate as well. It may also be a good idea to look at a buddy system. So when you have like a new person join the organization, is it possible for them to have a buddy? Because when you enter a new organization, you're very lost. You have so many questions and you don't know who to turn to. And often the managers make themselves available. It's not very easy for a new entrant to just reach out to the manager for the fear of, am I disturbing them? Is it too silly a question? Right? So to really have those buddies that they can have either within the group or someone maybe just like one level up as well who can really support them in their journey of just settling in into the organization. A third thing that can happen is even having a mentor, which could be in addition to a manager. So such that if they are experiencing any kind of anxieties, they have doubts about it, they can reach out to this mentor, and those conversations are going to be confidential, right? Such that that information that is being shared with the mentor is not going to be fed to the manager because this fear that if I talk about my anxiety, will the perception be that I don't have it in me to make it here? And usually this thought holds them back that am I going to be making a fool of myself? I'm going to embarrass myself. What will they really think of me? And people are concerned of the perception people are making of them, what is the image that's being created of them, especially in their first few days of your new job as well. So if we can really compartmentalize those and have separate like, uh, communications that could take place, that could be very, very helpful. Once we have done all of this, also looking at that we are not bombarding them with a lot of information of policies because nothing stays, right? It has to be done in a phased manner. And again, this will require doing some around a bit of surveys, focus group discussions to see what kind of systems and pacing really works for the new entrants as well. Uh, and lastly, a lot of organizations may have EAPs, HRs, letting them know where things are. So that's one part of it. Secondly, yes, induction program they do help because if they have more info, they have information that's going to allay their anxieties as well. So do preempt the questions that they're likely to have, including about leave. Very, very important for them, right? But the in terms of what will the induction look like, the probation period, place of location, other kind of support structures that are there. So do give them that information. and also check in constantly if there's anything that they would want to know more. I'm guessing this is already happening here in this space, but also it's important to review the existing system. Just because we have a system and that has been in operation for the last 5 years does not mean that's the successful system. So constantly reviewing our current systems also help, and getting that feedback even from people who have been into the system, say for 1 year, 2 years as well, and asking them what supported them during their induction at the time of joining, what did not support them. Some organizations also have feedback forms of the on the onboarding process. In my experience, people have entered the organization with a lot of anxiety because the onboarding process was very demanding. uh, I've also noticed this has come in for people who are from marginalized identities as well, like not having space for pronouns, or just having very binary pronouns, male, female, right? Or the fact that someone who's from who's gender non-binary, from trans community as well, not having gender neutral bathrooms, even having space for feedback or what could organizations do better, either as part of the onboarding systems or of the infrastructure, that could also open up a space to reflect upon by the organization. Did I answer all the questions, Moise?
Part two of the question, Smriti, I'm just going to remind you, it was also so you did talk about processes that could be supportive, but how do you embrace and accept the fact that a person is facing anxiety when they are afraid to do so and face the reality?
Yeah, okay. So I think we could start off from the trainer's position itself, because the trainer is seen as someone in position of authority. And if there is a culture that you want to create of vulnerability as well, starting with self-disclosure. So you know what, hey, I'm here, but I'm also experiencing a lot of anxiety addressing these 50 people, and also wondering what you may be thinking of me. And you're likely to be get a response in terms of laughter and nervous laughter as well. And then asking people, okay, who all are having similar kind of thoughts. Can we have a show of hands? Have you also experienced this anxiety, or any tips in terms of what do I do to manage this anxiety to be able to effectively deliver this induction session? So I think self-disclosure, humor, and recognizing anxiety is part of that room, acknowledging that it's also a human experience, and regardless of the position one holds, everyone experiences it. And just not having it in words, but to really demonstrate that acknowledgement and embracing of anxiety could be a good starting point. Uh, Hope that helps, Praful.
And there was one more point that I missed out from Praful's question, which was I would like to know how one can deal with the new job anxiety. So, as someone experiencing the anxiety in this entry level position, what are some of the things I need to keep in mind to manage that intensity of emotion?
I think this will require a lot of self work and individual work, because how one person may experience anxiety could be very different from how another person experiences anxiety as well, right? So anxiety may be a common experience, but the experience could be different. For example, one person may be experiencing anxiety in a way that every time I enter the room, I have my sweaty palms, or the other person is experiencing anxiety in terms of not being able fumbling and stuttering while making introduction, say I'm Smriti, and I'm not able to even say that, or what my prior experience is. Third would be just not making eye contact. So the experience itself could be different. And experience, when you look at it, I think we didn't really touch upon, and I know we're out of time, but to really talk about the anxiety could be happening at different levels. It could be at a emotional level, in terms of bringing a lot of nervousness, stress levels being really high, anger coming in, that there is could also be a meta emotion, that I'm getting anxious over getting anxious, that I'm experiencing this anxiety, that I'm getting anxious, and I'm feeling anxious over the fact that I'm going to be anxious, or I'm getting angry over myself for feeling anxiety right now, or I'm stressing over the fact that this anxiety is coming in. So there are also a lot of meta emotions that do come into play. That's at the emotional level. At the behavioral level, could be in terms of not able to make eye contact, stuttering, wanting to avoid the situation, entering late so that I don't have to introduce myself, because the introduction will be over by then. Could happen at the cognitive level, in terms of, what if I stutter? I'm going to make a fool of myself. I don't think I want to make a good impression, but I'm sure I'm going to slip up, right? at a physiological level. Like I said, sweaty palms, dry mouth, heart is racing, right? Just freezing completely. So all of those, so experience could be very different. Additionally, the experience would also be different because of my, say, past experiences. Like in the past, on my first day, I did slip up and people laughed at me. And I'm carrying that experience with me in this room, and I know that's likely to take place. And people are going to make fun of me. Or the fact that every time I introduce myself, people are not able to understand my name. So, say, for example, like me, I'll say I'm Smriti, people are going to address me as Samriti because I write Samriti, right? And that can be a point, and people wanting to clarify that with me can be a point of anxiety as well. Or the fact that if I come from a particular institute people have not heard of, as opposed to someone coming from a very reputed thing, and the moment person says that institute's name, everyone goes, oh wow, so, and not getting that kind of a response, or a judgment being made because I'm from a tier 2 or tier 3 city. So the experience of anxiety could is very, very layered, very nuanced, and very different for different people. And for each to just acknowledge that and to recognize that the experience could be different, and then for each person to do that work on themselves, to prepare themselves for those situations, and self-awareness, self-work along with compassion becomes very important.
And then always one can reach out to a therapist for additional support, or to the EAP provider should that be
Yeah.
support system available. Thank you, Praful, for the question. It was very layered, and I think both of us had to think through that as well. Um, I'm going to bring our conversation to a close, Smriti. We had one question, but I think you've already answered it. My question was going to be on what sustainable system practices or initiatives can we keep in mind as leaders, right, to build a culture that reduces the impact of anxiety. I just want to, because I made a note of what you mentioned when you were talking to Praful and answering the first part of the question, because I think you already checked a lot of these off. You talked about the buddy systems, mentorship programs, having regular check ins, having an open door policy, maintaining confidentiality, offering EAP services or therapeutic support, looking at the leave policies again, reviewing constantly policies and seeing if they fit through feedback forms, if there is any need for change for procedure or policy through feedback forms. You talked about having FTDs to do a check in with the group. Uh, yeah, and I think mostly you did also talk about revisiting processes. You were talking about onboarding, but I think we can extend that to all processes within an organization. Really asking for feedback on that. Just before we close, Smriti, from your own experience, you are a leader. You're running, Equilibrium Advisory with Sana and Shivangi, and putting in so many policies and practices to support employee well-being. Are there any other tidbits you want to leave other folks with before we log off today?
And I like to revisit the idea of having well-being policies and well-being initiatives, with a clear intention, right? Say, because you did talk about us as leaders as well. So at Equilibrio, we do have the initiative of Mental Health Week Off, which we started 3 years ago during the pandemic, because that came out as one of the conversations with all our colleagues, that how they are languishing. It's just been such a demanding time of the year, and it's been difficult to just take a break. And at that point in time, we had introduced this initiative of giving 10 days off to all the team members, and the entire firm shuts down. Uh, and we've been able to replicate that for 3 consecutive years, and we hope to continue doing this. And I think this was again a response to, in terms of how the team was really feeling, and and the positive feedback that we got from the team, that this was really helpful to really bring back focus onto their self-care, onto their own needs. That's going to help them feel re-energized, rejuvenated, which is over and above the time off over the weekends or the entitled leave as well, because this really gives them time to only focus on themselves, because everyone else is working.
Mhm.
And there's no expectation with regards to social commitments of being available to travel or do other things, but this really gives them really the time off to do things that they want to do for themselves as individuals, right? And that has really been the given us the impetus to continue doing this. I remember, since we work in the space of Posh, and know our teams get fairly occupied towards the end of the year for compliance work or for inquiries and training, because these are all statutory requirements. And when the entire world mostly is rejoicing and taking see considers December as a lean month, that's the most hectic period for us. And we did see this last year, and we decided to give the first 3 days of the calendar year, so people were off till 3rd or 4th of January, right? Because we realized that exhaustion was coming in, and we could see that in responses, we could see that in team meetings and team connects as well. So I think as when you talk about employee well-being, we need as employers we need to have a flexible approach that there are systems in place which have been working for us, and we can continue to operate from those stance. But the employees change, the demands change from year on year, and if we are on pulse with the employees, and if the well-being is part of our intention and as our value, it's important to recruit the position of flexibility and to introduce policies or revisit policies or change policies if required as well, if that's the need of the hour and that's what your colleagues need at that point in time. So, so that's the last thought that I would like to leave with all the organizations and employees as well, to do those check-ins, be on pulse, and not shy away from just breaking away from the existing systems and structures, but reviewing that, revisiting those, or introducing something, because the policies are for employees. It's just not a good to have, but it has a practical reason for its existence, and that needs the spirit of it needs to be taken into consideration while leading a team.
Thank you so much, Niti. I think you've also summed it up. A lot of the conversations intersecting, and you really closed with bringing practical suggestions to, and also sharing how we really do this at Equilibrio as well. So thank you for bringing your vulnerability here. I appreciate it. We are very much out of time. We're 10 minutes past. So I'm just going to leave with a reminder to all of those who've tuned in. If you have lingering questions or thoughts that you would like to email us, our email ID is at the bottom. You can write to therapy at mentalhealth@work.life. You can also visit our website and contact us. And if there is anyone who would like to have a conversation about how to take these initiatives and policies forward at their organizations, feel free to reach out to us. Happy to support you. Thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Rosanna. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Have a good evening. Bye.